It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today again for another installment of the Hoover program on the U.S., China, and the World Speaker Series. It's particularly a joy to welcome Minxin Pei back to Hoover. Many years ago, Minxin was a national fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and he's a recidivist. He joins us every time he has a book, and today is no exception to that, really. He's here to share his latest excellent work, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. Minxin Pei is a renowned expert in Chinese politics, governance, and U.S.-China relations. He's currently serving as the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College. He served as the inaugural Library of Congress Chair on U.S.-China relations in 2019. Before joining Claremont McKenna in 2009, he was for many years a senior associate and director of the China program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Professor Pei is the author of many influential articles and books, including China's Crony Capitalism in 2016, The Sentinel State in 2024, and the subject of today's lecture, The Broken China Dream, How Reform Revived Totalitarianism. It's a great pleasure, Professor Pei, to welcome you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Client. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. First, I want to thank the Hoover Institution for organizing today's event. In particular, I want to thank my good friend, mentor, colleague, Larry Diamond, for his decades of support. The book is dedicated to Larry, just so you know. First, I want to spend a few minutes on the title. The Broken China Dream. We all know what Xi Jinping's China Dream is, because when I picked the title, I said, what would be a good title? So I said, well, let's just play. I have on the phrase of Xi Jinping's, the China Dream title, because I think his China Dream is a very different kind of dream than most Chinese would be dreaming. If I understand him correctly, his dream was a China ruled by one-party regime forever, and the one-party regime would elevate China to the front ranks of global power. But that's not the kind of dream that I think people like me would like to have. The dream that most Chinese would like to have is a prosperous, free, and normal country. But that kind of dream under Xi Jinping's rule is unlikely to be realized. So this is the one. And post-Mao China has three very distinct phases. The most turbulent and the most interesting phase was the 1980s. This is a decade in which China opened up, in which all kinds of possibilities existed. The leaders were divided as to what kind of policies to have. And also for about a decade, you had liberals in the party, you had relatively pragmatic leaders like Deng Xiaoping in the party, but you also have hardline conservatives in the party. And the party fought viciously inside the leadership, and the decade ended with the Tiananmen Square, with the Tiananmen Square massacre. But it's also a decade that started China's journey toward globalization, global integration. And it was for people who, I think a lot of people in the audience actually lived, worked, interacted with China in the 1980s. It is a decade that was the freest in post-1949 China. You just cannot find another decade. Then the second period, I call this the post-Tiananmen period, is the period of China's economic miracle. This is the period in which the party rallied around one very clear ideological strategy, ideological direction and survival strategy. That is economic performance-based legitimacy, integration with the global economy, and a great deal of market opening and reform. It all started with Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, 1992, and it ended with the rise of Xi Jinping. So it was during this period that we saw unprecedented economic growth in China. And also, this is a period in which elite politics was remarkably stable. And foreign policy was relatively pragmatic. So this is the sort of the second decade, distinct decade. Then we have the neo-Stalinist, neo-totalitarian period. This is the label doesn't matter. But starting with Xi Jinping's rise in late 2012, we had a revival of a form of dictatorship that most thought would be impossible or unthinkable. So this is the crackdown in Hong Kong. This is personality cult, and you have a complete shift in foreign policy. So on the surface, these three periods appear to be ruptures because each of them is very different from the other. But what I argue in the book is that when you think about it, they all have connections. Namely, what happened in the 1980s narrowed the possibilities for future developments, ruling out certain possibilities, but also increasing others. In other words, when we think about the Xi Jinping era, we have to go back to what happened in the 1980s. So let's now look at I'll take one step back just to emphasize just how whether today we are having what we're seeing in China is a form of totalitarianism. Not, it's actually a pretty big deal to slap this label of totalitarianism on China. I think it's controversial. I struggle with this, but at the end of the day, I would say China is now closer to totalitarianism than to authoritarianism. Okay, so this is the Maoist era. Incidentally, this gentleman with this big plaque on his neck is Xi Jinping's father. So this is during the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards burning books. You have just thousands of people holding up Mao's portrait during the Cultural Revolution. So this is Cultural Revolution style purge. This is Xi Jinping style purge. These two were his political rivals. This is Bo Xilai, this is Zhou Yongkang. And then instead of mass terror, she relies on state terror. You have the concentration camp in Xinjiang, you have high-tech surveillance, and this looks remarkably like this. And this is a corner of the Chinese bookstore. I think Xi Jinping is the world's best-selling author. And it makes people like us really upset because we work so hard to get a book published and nobody buys it, right? And he has a team of people, ghostwriters, churning out books, filling Chinese bookstores, and all state entities in China have to buy his books. So, but this is just part of the personality cult. So if you look at these two pictures, I think at a very basic level, you can make a reasonable argument that China has indeed gone back to the future. So now, how did that happen? Because the survivors of Mao's rule, that one of the top priorities after they regained the power in the 1980s was that never again. They did not want to see a repeat of totalitarianism. This one thing about dictatorships that we often don't appreciate. Dictatorships don't like dictators. That is the irony, because dictatorships that have dictators make elites in dictatorships insecure, unsafe. So what Deng Xiaoping and that's his ideological rival, Chen Yun, this is Peng Zhen, a conservative, he was exiled. He did not suffer directly on the Mao. He was locked up in China's infamous jail for senior cadre. And once he came out, this is what he said: I was locked up by the KMT before 49. Believe me, the Communist Party's jail is much worse than KMT's jail. So these were the victims of Mao's rule. And they were determined not to have another Mao to terrorize the party again. So they implemented a set of reforms in the 1980s. The primary goal was really to restore collective leadership, to introduce and establish, implement a set of rules to make the party, to make elite politics a lot more predictable, a lot more rule-based, a lot less vicious. So in other words, you say normalized dictatorship. But at the same time, they faced enormous difficulties in making these reforms work. Is that, first of all, these reforms cannot touch the underlying Leninist system, because this is how the party's power is going to be based and exercised. And the other problem with them, that they also want to maintain their own discretion. That's a feature of all autocracies. They don't want them to be bound by rules. And another problem, even though they did not like Mao for what he did to them and to the party, they still had to defend Mao's legacy. So they operated within very serious constraints. So I want to show just one example. For a long time, there was this perception about the Chinese system that China had retirement, had age limits and term limits. That is true only for ministers, provincial governors. It's not true for Politburo members. So there were never explicit limits on age and terms for Politburo members, for a reason, because in the early 1980s, all these aging leaders were above 80. So they just could not set those explicit limits. So in other words, the institutionalizations in the 1980s, introduced by Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues, were incomplete, were in the long run ineffective. So now let's just make the connection between the institutionalization reforms in the 1980s and what happened under Xi Jinping's rule. First, the Chinese case under Xi Jinping, historically speaking, is actually the first case in history where a totalitarian system moved away from totalitarian system and then returned. The Soviet Union did not have to see this. The Eastern Europe, maybe we just don't have too few totalitarian systems around. But this is really the first case. A second point I want to underscore is that it was unanticipated. Deng did not see this coming. The people who, least of all, the people who put Xi in place, did not see this coming. And I can bet, had they known what was going to happen under Xi, Xi would not have been picked. And this is because these people were all but a lot of them suffered under Xi. So that's one. In retrospect, that is, Deng and his colleagues built very weak guardrails against the return of somebody like Xi Jinping. I've already talked about the age and term limits. They had very explicit prohibitions against personality cult and against the violation of collective leadership. But when you read these provisions, there were no enforcement mechanisms. Those documents did not say what would happen, how the party would punish people who would violate these rules and norms. And another thing is that Deng and his other colleagues in the 1980s violated these rules all the time, because this is how they purged the two leading reformers in the 1980s. They were fired without following the rules the party set up. Also, we need to be aware that in a dictatorship, it's impossible to enforce rules. In a democracy, we now know it's actually pretty hard. But in a dictatorship, because in a democracy, we really rely, of course, on the goodness of the people in power, right? But that's a very thin defense. But we really rely on third-party enforcers, courts, the media, civil society, public opinion. None of these would exist in a dictatorship. And Deng himself bore a lot of responsibility because he was very staunchly against any democracy in society. He thought democracy would undermine his modernization project. And when Deng was in power, he did not push any so-called inter-party democracy, that is, making political competition within the party somehow more active and binding. So that is sort of why the guardrails were like a house of cards. When Xi pushed against them after he came to power, there was no resistance. Now, come to sort of this. Xi himself could not do this. Just one man, right? He had to rely on the system. So that gets us to another question. How come totalitarian practices could be restored so quickly? Really overnight, you will see between 2013, 2014, many of the things that we thought impossible happened. I remember talking to a very successful entrepreneur who was very big on social media. They had, between the couple, they had tens of millions of followers. In China, they call it Big V, right? Verified. They said, okay, they couldn't touch us. We have so much public following. Then fast forward, within a few months, they all disappeared. So how could that happen? That is because Deng Xiaoping actually kept, the Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, kept intact all the underlying totalitarian institutions. This is the 4 cardinal principles Deng Xiaoping laid down. 1979. This is shortly after he gained power. It's, I think, March 1979. And if you read carefully, it's basically what he's saying is that the Communist Party system, regime, the most important institutions, which is coercion and the party's monopoly of power, could not be touched. So in other words, throughout this period, that is up to Xi's rise to power, totalitarian institutions were preserved. Even though, what I say, totalitarian practices, that is mass terror, personality cult, internal purge, these are practices, these are not institutions, they were suspended. For a long time, I personally struggled with the term post-totalitarian. So what is this? I think now I have a pretty good sort of definition. It is the preservation of the system without the resort to its practices. So in other words, this whole system is like this piece of machinery, which basically has retained its functionalities. The only thing that happened is that the power was shut off. So here you have the off-off. When Xi Jinping came to power, he simply pushed the on switch. And voila, you have the whole system springing back to life. So this is a reflection on how the totalitarianism returned. To add a little bit, because we have to understand that Deng Xiaoping's survival strategy for the Communist Party is something called neo-authoritarianism. It's a very unique form of autocracy. That is, it's kind of autocracy that is completely focused on economic development, because that would keep the regime in power. Deng did not see one of the key flaws that he thought. When I read Deng's speeches on democracy, on development, he was firmly convinced that democracy was bad for economic development. He would constantly raise objections because there will be different voices and so forth. So he's only one party can make decisions, can make economic modernization happen. What he did not realize, maybe he did realize, but he did not say it, is that under that kind of system, you will have systematic endemic corruption, because when the wealth grows and the wealth is controlled by a party that is not subject to public scrutiny, media, and so forth, you're going to have corruption. That's what happened. Besides the direct impact of corruption, what corruption did was to make a very large group of top elites exposed, either because they're connected or because they can be seen as connected with scandals. So when Xi Jinping came to power, this is one of China's most corrupt officials, and that's the loot he hit. He had no difficulty, because all he needed to do was to investigate them, to show their family is corrupt, they themselves are corrupt, so he could get rid of them very quickly. So that's how Deng Xiaoping's reform actually paved the way for the return of totalitarianism without realizing this. And even before Xi Jinping's rise, there were warning signs that the system could return. The first warning sign was under Jiang Zemin. 1999, Falun Gong. You said, what about Falun Gong? Falun Gong was a group that had tens of millions of followers. The party decided to crush Falun Gong. No authoritarian regime would have the same kind of capability. But the Chinese Communist Party crushed Falun Gong within a year. I think within a few months, they just got rid of it. So the practices used to crush this vast network of semi-religious followers were extremely brutal, really reminiscent of totalitarianism. So that's one. The other is, you would think that sort of ideologically you would not have the same kind of totalitarian practices coming back. This is Chongqing. This is the guy who now sits in jail, Bo Xilai. When he became the Chongqing party chief, he did what Xi Jinping later would do throughout the country. He arrested private entrepreneurs, accused them of getting involved in organized crime, and he began to sing Maoist songs. The surprising thing about him is he was not stopped. Actually, only one Politburo Standing Committee member, Hu Jintao, did not go to Chongqing because if you go to somebody's place, it shows endorsement. Xi Jinping went, everybody went. And for a long time, he was seen as a plausible future. So that also meant that the soil of totalitarianism remained quite fertile in China. So now the question is, how come? Because the post-Tiananmen era is a very strange period because it's so unusual for a dictatorship. So if it's argued that the institutions of totalitarianism were intact, the guardrails were weak, how come collective leadership was preserved for 2 decades? For 2 decades, the system appeared to be working. And a lot of seasoned scholars say, okay, China has achieved the impossible. Resilient authoritarianism, authoritarian institutionalization. My explanation is that it's not institutionalization, because when you look at the lineup of elites, it was a very strange period in which all the competing factions were more or less equally matched. So my analogy is that this is a period equivalent to multipolar geopolitics. That is, it has some kind of self-enforcing mechanism at work. None of the factions would like to see another faction become dominant. But toward the end of this era, the Hu Jintao era, this balance of power began to dissipate. I think it was very weak. Jiang Zemin was getting old. Hu Jintao was a very weak leader. So this was not maintained. Okay, so now let me now quickly sort of deal with this issue, because another question we ask about China is how come economic modernization has not led to democracy? Did the West miscalculate and so forth? Here I want to, because Larry is one of the world's leading scholars on democracy, and Larry can correct me. Even though I think this is a former Stanford professor, really a towering figure in political sociology and political science, even though we have a very solid relationship between the existence of democracy and the level of wealth, we actually do not know how economic development will bring about democracy. These are two very different questions. We can identify a few plausible explanations, but when you use whatever methodology approach, you just don't have a very clear answer. That is, to develop a very clear theory backed by evidence that shows that a given level of increase in your economic development would actually increase the probability of a country becoming democratic. We just don't have that kind of research to show this. On the other hand, I think much more recent scholarship shows that this relationship does not exist. That is, there is no such thing as a linear relationship between the level of economic development and the country's probability of becoming democracy. So this is the person who made this really important finding. At the same time, when you actually look at how countries democratize through the process of reform, not revolution, and the conclusion is very clear. It's the elites within the ruling regime. You have to, in other words, it had to come from within the regime. Now, so in other words, we have to look at the role of the Chinese Communist Party. And now, why that did not happen? In the 1980s, there was actually a very narrow window, because for a country to have the transition from dictatorship to democracy, the precondition is not give a certain level of economic development. The precondition is reformers inside the regime. So in the 1980s, we have two extraordinary individuals serving as the General Secretaries of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. Hu Yaobang was purged in 1987. He was succeeded by Zhao Ziyang. Not much is known outside China about one project undertaken by Zhao Ziyang to reform the political system. This is like 1980s, there was an elite-led attempt to change the system. It was relatively modest. You would say it's a plan to reform a totalitarian system into a much more authoritarian system. And he entrusted the task to his advisor, Bao Tong, the plan was drafted. Deng Xiaoping actually sort of endorsed it, but the party did not accept it. And Deng Xiaoping actually, toward the end, didn't like the plan at all because it would weaken the party. And then Tiananmen Square happened. So there was this what should I say, anecdote that would show that China could have been different. When you think about has Tiananmen Square not happened, just think who would be the leaders. We actually know he would succeed, and then he would give his successor will be another reformer. So it will be a very, very different kind of situation. Of course, you can fantasize about another China. Here, I also want to say something positive about modernization, economic development. Economic development may not have changed the Chinese Communist Party, but it did change Chinese society. A lot of positive developments occurred in China in the post-Tiananmen period. You had protest, you had much more aggressive semi-official media, citizen journalism. You have lawyers. This is really a hero, my hero. His name is Xu Ziyong. He's now serving a 15-year jail sentence. Just to illustrate the difference between the post-Tiananmen period and the Xi Jinping period. He got his national fame by suing the government for enforcing an unconstitutional regulation on vagrancy. And the government abolished this as a result. And after he became nationally famous, he ran for local People's Congress in Beijing, got elected twice, and he was not prevented from serving. He founded an NGO. Now, fast forward to the Xi Jinping era. The year after Xi Jinping came to power, he was arrested, accused of, charged with some ridiculous crime, put in jail for 3 years or 4 years. Then he was let out. He wrote a letter to Xi Jinping, a public letter denouncing Xi Jinping's handling of COVID. He was arrested, and now he's serving 15 years. Just see the night and day. So Chinese society has been transformed. But unfortunately, all these positive changes happened at the periphery of the political system. As long as the political system itself has not changed. So now, why didn't the Chinese political system change? Let's now revert to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the things the Communist Party of China studied the most. My joke is that to find a real expert of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you actually go to Beijing, because they published lots of books, they have a documentary. What they've learned is that in order to prevent another collapse of the Soviet, collapse in China similar to the Soviet Union, you've got to prevent reformers from emerging from within. This is what Deng Xiaoping said. If China were to have a problem, the problem would emerge from within the Communist Party. He knew. So in the post-Tiananmen era, no reformers could rise to the top. And at the same time, they've learned a lot from Tiananmen and from the Soviet Union. That is, you've got to increase your coercive capacity. So one thing you may not be aware of, that when Tiananmen protests happened, China had no specially trained anti-riot police. They did not, I don't think they even had gas canisters. In other words, they were totally unprepared. But of course, the 1980s was a decade of liberal opening and so forth. You could explain that. But after the 1980s, the party began to invest systematically in its coercive capacity. So that's they cultivated nationalism. And so they found a new survival strategy that worked until it stopped working when Xi Jinping came to power. Okay, I think I've spoken long enough. So we'll cover this. And if you want to talk about sort of how China's engagement ended in the confrontation between China and the West, we can deal with that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a great presentation, Minxin. Since we're here at a university, let's put our professorial hats on for a minute. You said a very important word, linear, in your discussion about the relationship between democratization and wealth.
Yes.
And one of the terms that arises in your book is path determinism, which is a sort of a linear kind of argument. Basically, the idea that once you start down a road, it gets progressively harder to change the path that you're on. From the vantage of 1989, it certainly looks like a universe of more pluralistic options began to close for China. And that's a linear explanation. You show the narrowing of options, right? And it's sort of a supreme irony that under Xi Jinping, who has been the greatest critic of economic involution, he's pursuing a path of political involution in a way, right? But let me propose an alternative. Okay. I'm a historian. We think about periodization differently. To me, you could say that the 1980s might be the trough in a sine wave that is varied in amplitude over time. Sometimes you get more authoritarianism, totalitarianism, sometimes you get a little bit less. But the point is that there's a cycle here. And the 1980s was this post-traumatic period after the Cultural Revolution in which the party was still decentered. Right? So as you say, things were in flux and in balance somewhat, which created opportunities for other ideas to flourish. And there was a moment at which alternative futures were possible. But of course, that ended in bloodshed when the party sort of found its feet again and asserted itself when its unity and survival were very much at stake, right? So this idea of sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, cycling has been a part of the life of the CCP really from its foundings. You could even go back to Yan'an and the rectification movement or the anti-rightist campaign and so forth. It's this idea that Trotsky introduced, a permanent revolution. It's how a revolutionary party renews itself. And the reason that I mention it is because if you think of it that way, then the path does not necessarily lead to a cul-de-sac, of involution, right? Where the straight line of options narrows to an infinitesimal point. There is a possibility at which new moments may arise where we're back in a trough, where opportunities may present themselves for a more pluralistic future for China to emerge. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And whether you think, as you mentioned, China has changed even if the political system hasn't, if the last 40 years of economic and social development have in fact made it easier for a transition to a more pluralistic China when the opportunity presents itself.
I would say it would make it easier because when I reflect on the modernization theory, I think everything else being equal, if authoritarian regime or even totalitarian regimes such as the post-totalitarian regime, such as Gorbachev's Soviet Union, when the elites make the decision to exit power or change the system, the likelihood of a successful transition would be greater in a much more developed society than in a less developed society, because you're going to have a lot more social capital and all the other good things that would support a new democracy, right? So that is so that on that point, I totally agree with you. But if I understand your question correctly, I think what you seem to imply is that in this sort of a cyclical, what have you called it, this wave-like some historical pattern. If that pattern is real, then we are probably going to see a breakthrough at some point, or see the another possibility of dramatic change. That is the end of the Xi period could present China with a window of opportunity not that dissimilar to the end of the Maoist period. Where I can be quite optimistic on that. I think that I've said this many times, and I'll say this again. The party tends to swing wildly. You can see its policy swings, like from Mao to Deng, and then just back to Xi. And a lot of that really depends on how destructive or self-destructive the regime is. The Maoist regime is really self-destructive. So that would bring the party, that would give Deng Xiaoping the mandate to make changes. So in the case of Xi Jinping, if by the time he exits the political scene, China is in a horrible state, then I think we should be prepared for some very dramatic changes.
Yeah. So let's see.
So that's according. So that is certainly not linear. Yeah.
Right. So let me. Go ahead.
But I want to say, past dependence is a different concept. It seems that certain things, if you want to, that they just make changes much harder. Yeah. Or make incremental changes much harder. But then, if you want to make changes, then you're much likely to have rupture.
Right. Let's talk about this idea of rupture, then, or the possibility of it. Some people see a really different China than the broken one that's described in your book, and it's easy to understand why. Right? You open up the newspaper, you see a China, and certainly China is not shy about telling you. China's powering from strength to strength, high-speed rail, affordable, high-quality electric vehicles, these amazing AI models, a new surging biotechnology sector, wind, nuclear, all of these things, right? That's a China that's very much in contrast with the broken dream hypothesis. And there can be many Chinas coexisting at once, which is one of the most interesting things about China. But do you think that there is a reckoning between these two Chinas that is simply a matter of time, in which the China of the hypermodern, the high-stakes gamble Xi Jinping is making on techno-nationalism will run out of steam, and we will maybe hit that rupture or that reckoning? How sustainable is that China?
First, I think there are certain aspects of China that are truly successful, impressive, right? You see that, we all see them. Then you ask the question, if that is the case, how come the economic momentum is clearly dissipating? It's not increasing. They made several major policy mistakes. They can take off some successes like EV, others, but the big ones, the huge credit bubble. This is holding, when you look at, it's in the book, when you look at when China began to lose the momentum, it's actually around 2008. And they start blowing this gigantic credit bubble. And when you look at Xi Jinping's first decade in power, he did not put in any serious economic reforms to deal with well-known problems, fiscal, there's a long list. So that's one. And the real estate bubble connected with this. So now they're dealing with the aftermath. So so we can look at the sort of achievements, but the really big ones. And also when you look at now, the issue we're all aware of, that is demography. They were warned many, many years ago. It's not just, and when did Xi Jinping start making adjustments? 2015. Mine is if you have some, I think you can have two, you still, this is not the image of a decisive leader, right? Because I think it corrected quite later. So that is, and also, I think we hear a lot about decoupling in this, but for the last, until the last 5 or 6 years ago, China's economy was deeply integrated into the global economy, still today is. But if your foreign policy is going to antagonize your most valuable, most important trading partners, don't you think you should actually think about the consequences?
That's an important point that I think could be learned more broadly.
That is, if you want to sort of be mean to your customers, don't you think they're going to come and buy stuff from you? So I think a lot of things they did not think about. It's so remarkable when the real policy shift under Xi Jinping occurred in 2020. This is when the party put out a blue print for the 14th five-year plan. This is actually, you need to read. It will be it's a historic document. It's gradually shifted. And you say, why 2020? Probably you should do this sooner, because his foreign policy shift began immediately after he came to power. Right? Building those islands. Don't you think you should actually anticipate the global blowback? So that's there a lot of other things. Of course, where did these achievements come from? I think the Chinese state has received deserved credit. It should deserve some credit because it actually spent a lot of money on this. I mean, this is part. But when you see who the actual producers are, they're private entrepreneurs. Yeah. They're not a challenge to find one SOE, one single state entity of the EV makers and I think there's one or two EV, but solar, all the others, battery power, they're all private entrepreneurs.
So I want to turn to our in-person and our online audience in just a moment, but let me leave you with one last question, and that is, you mentioned the really intensive study that happened across the 1990s of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the lessons that the party drew from it. You use the term New Cold War in the book, right? That we are now in a new Cold War with China. So what do you think the lessons that the United States could learn from the old Cold War with the Soviet Union might be that could inform the United States thinking about where China is today? And what might be the wrong lessons to draw from that period?
Yeah, it's I actually teach a course called the New Cold War, so I should be able to answer this question. I think I'm not so sure whether the US has actually learned the right lessons from the Cold War. It's highly political. How was the Cold War won? There's no consensus in this country. I mean, you would say Reagan's tough policy, the Soviet Union, the people I sort of respect a lot. These are the Russian scholars, people who study Russian domestic politics. It's Gorbachev. So I actually tend to believe that they are right, because changes come from within. External pressure helps. If I have to say the right lessons is that first, the most important lesson is to prevent Cold War from turning hot. This is the most important lesson. And I don't think we are paying enough attention to that. So that is one. And second is that I think to some extent we are trying to fight the old Cold War because we know how to do it. The US was much more advantageously positioned, and the Soviet Union kept shooting itself in the foot. So that's the ideal situation. And I think there's probably less appreciation of sort of the new opponent, China, the new adversary is thinking about this, because one thing about the Chinese Communist Party is that despite all its mistakes and so forth, it actually pays a lot of attention to history. It learns a lot from, it tries to learn a lot. So probably if I were inside the Chinese regime and know a little bit about what their strategy is they try not to fight the old Cold War because they know it's at least they don't want to make the same mistakes. But if you have a political system that is not that different from the Soviet system, then it was political involution that they could sort of, despite their best efforts, they might make the same mistakes.
Thank you. So, to the audience, and Larry, please.
So you mentioned 4 means by which the CCP has tried to respond to modernization and keep a lid on the potential, democratizing implications of modernization. And you spoke about the first 2, and then I think, were feeling that you were running out of time and didn't say much about the last 2. So they were preventing the rise of reformists, increasing coercive capacity, which you talked about in your previous book, and then promoting nationalism and sustaining economic growth. So I have a pair of questions about the second 2.
Yeah.
Number 1, I assume you will allow an extension of the promoting nationalism to include the whole kind of propaganda campaign surrounding the facilitation or encouragement of nationalism to, getting young people to have the correct ideas and sealing them off from the incorrect ideas. And so question 1 is, how's that going? And it seems like it's had some impact from the anecdotal evidence we hear. I'm not inclined to want to believe that, but I can't ignore the anecdotal evidence I'm hearing. And then the second question is kind of left hanging from everything you've said, which is that what happens if the carousel stops moving? And, we not only get a slowdown in economic growth, that's obviously happened and was inevitable, but we basically get, an entry into what has been speculated as a way of dealing with these contradictions that you are articulating, which is potentially an extended period that looks a lot like Japanese-style stagnation.
Yeah. For a while, I was skeptic about nationalism. I said, could this thing really work? Now, I tend to give the Chinese Communist Party a lot of credit for doing something that I used to be skeptical about. I think it worked. It was far more successful than most of us would realize, because the picture is when I teach Chinese nationalism, I would put 2 pictures 10 years apart. Statue of the Goddess of Liberty facing Mao's portrait on Tiananmen, and then the trashed US Embassy in May 1999, 10 years apart. How do you these students who trashed the US Embassy strong after the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, they did this spontaneously. They were not the government did not send them there to act as rioters. So that's and I'm sort of dealing. So based on a lot of observations, social media, popular culture, and so that is, I think that still helps. How long that's going to sustain the party in an environment of economic downturn, we don't know, because this is just happening. So in terms of economic downturn, my observation, it has to be quite long, extended. 3 years wouldn't do it. Probably it would take a decade. So now we date the downturns of 2023 after COVID. We're only the 4th year into this. So I think it's we still need to give it a few more years to know. But this does not mean the party is not worried. I think they're very, very concerned about their inability to turn this big, to turn around the economy.
There was this moment to Larry's question right after COVID in which an entire generation I think, experience that maybe the party wasn't as competent as it professed to be, and they're followed by the economic slowdown and the despair. In your observation, has that stuck among younger people, which is in dissonance with the sort of nationalism that they're being taught? Maybe the party is bungling it after all.
Yeah, that certainly is a big stumble, but we need to see another, because you need to reinforce it. It's not like the Cultural Revolution or several big things. Maybe the sort of the purge could be the political shock of the purge at the popular level could be something that people will start asking questions about.
Thanks so much, Minxin. Great book, which, as you know, I've read, and great talk. So I'm trying to think about how to phrase this question. Maybe I have like a half a question and a question. And the half a question is, don't you think it's possible to have both Chinese people be nationalistic on the one hand when it comes to looking at China's role on the global stage, but disaffected domestically in how they think about some of the governing policies for the people in the society? So that can coexist, right? And so that's the one question. The other is the question I personally hate the most when I get it, but I'm going to ask you, because maybe you're going to give me something that I can just copy in the future. And that is, I mean, your sort of analysis is a lot about institutions and the robustness of them and the parties put in place, and then the importance of the leader, right? And that's, so with the Chinese people themselves, you said change comes from within. What do you see as the path forward that gets China past the institutions and to fundamental political reform? What do you see as the most likely confluence of sort of, indicators of factors that would lead to that?
Yeah, I had both the good fortune and the bad fortune of growing up in Maoist China. So my frame of reference is that period. 4 years before Mao died, people began to think about what happens. That's a very positive change, because when you start thinking about life after a certain leader, then you begin to sort of do things, right? So that is the other. Another thing is that this also the Maoist period, people did not talk to each other, but people were not dumb. They felt that things were really bad. Not just ordinary people. I was a teenager. I was working in a factory, but educate people. People within the party were thinking about this. So, in other words, if I have to sort of see how things would happen, is that it's like an invisible, I wouldn't say disease, awareness that things cannot go on like this. I mean, if you recall what Gorbachev, in Gorbachev's memoir, this is the night before he became, he said, we could not go on living like this. I think that is the moment hope is born. And that is not just ordinary people. It has to be inside the party. Of course, people in the party, they are double-faced, right? They would shout the slogans, would pledge allegiance to the party, Xi Jinping and so forth. But inside they are thinking that these are real people. And then gradually, this invisible coordination is that they all feel that way. And I'm sure that right now, quite a number of people, it's impossible to verify, but a lot of people know that China is not moving in the right direction. And a few years from now, if Xi does not change, and I don't think he's going to change, because his entire political fortune is tied to his policy, then things are going to get worse. And then this sense will spread, will intensify. So this is all I can think of, okay?
Jean, and then Rowena.
Thank you. I have to say, I really look forward to reading the book. But I want to take you to your title.
Yes.
Because I want to ask you what you mean by this totalitarianism, or I think you also used the word neo-totalitarianism. So what do you mean? And I also want to then, once I hear what your definition is, to understand, quote, how, quote, effective is it? Because depending on how effective is it, we then question, how do you get to these changes that you're sort of hinting at, and that would lead you to actually, in the end, be optimistic?
Okay, so thank you. Because this is just one word that gave me a lot of trouble in the course of writing the book, because you have to sort of now you think about totalitarianism in sort of using two methods. One is so-called categorical. You develop a list, check boxes that China meet. The other is you must continue. That is, on one end, you will say this is a typical also dictatorship. You can authoritarian regime. My word is garden variety authoritarian regime. Then the other is extreme would be totalitarian rule. So first look at the list we are familiar with, right? You have a totalitarian party, you have a totalitarian leader, you have the use of terror as a means of governing, constant purges within the party, you have complete control of the coercive force, you have the complete control of the bureaucracy, you have complete control of the economy. You have official ideology. So if you go down the list and say today, where would China sort of fit? Where would Xi Jinping's China fit? I would say it will fit at least sort of most of the category. Totalitarian leader, use of terror, purges, personality cult, control of coercive capacity. I think where he falls short is really the economy. This is where I still have a lot of hope for that. Despite sort of the fact that the economy alone cannot change the political system, ideology, I think he can institute fear, but he cannot make people believe Mao again. He cannot make people believe communism again. So I think this is sort of that's why it falls short. It's not completely totalitarian, but it's not, a lot of the stuff that is totalitarian is still there in the institution. Then you look at the continuum, that one end and another. Let's say the middle point is 5. Extreme totalitarianism is classic totalitarianism, Maoism, Stalinism is 10. I think China is at least 7, right? I wouldn't say it's 5. I think on the Hu Jintao, probably Jiang Zemin, it will be 4 or 3. It was moving in that direction. But today, I think if I have to make a mistake, I would rather say it's totalitarian rather than authoritarian. Initially, the editor said the revival of authoritarianism. I say authoritarianism never went away. So anyway, so this is thank you for sort of neo. I think neo part is when you have trouble, you always put neo in there. If it's in Cold War, it's really hard. It's in terms of sort of conceptualizing the regime type.
Thank you so much, Minxin. I'm so glad that you brought up Xu Zhiyong and Pu Zhiqiang. I think those two examples actually are the indications of what China has become. I remember right after Tiananmen, Pu Zhiqiang and Xu Jinping, they were advocating citizenship movement with love. So that was the time of hope, and all the way up to, I remember when VOA was closed down, this dark message posted by Pu Zhiqiang about what's happening inside China and outside. And my question to you would be more like, I've been watching, congratulations for the new book about this broken China dream nightmare to us. So I watched from the first, the Rising China time of the China transition, the CHAP transition, the first book, and all the way, you have been very perceptive from even the time when the whole world was having this illusion about China. So I just wonder if it's fair to say that all the way from 89 post-Mao to 89 post of totalitarianism, nationalism up till now. Is it fair if we just quote what Ross said? Like if you look at 1979 democracy crackdown, you will know that they were never serious about political reform, even in the 1980s. And that's why 89 should not come as a surprise. So I wonder if that actually can explain all the way up to where we are today, because from day one, even 79, 78, end of 78, 79, they were never ever serious about political reform in China.
Okay. Well, my political awakening occurred a lot later. My first book was quite positive, actually, about China. From reform to revolution, I saw China probably had a better route than the Soviet Union. My real awakening was China's transition. That's 20 years ago. And I said, when you look at the logic, but by that time, they were slowing down in changing the political system. So I think from then on, I stayed on the right track. So today, even though the book, it's a very sort of tragic story, because when you think about China, it's how better it could have become. And the Chinese people so hardworking, and they deserve much better. But then they have somebody who thinks that 1950s were the best period for China. Okay, then he tries to institute the system. But I think after Xi, we're going to have an opportunity for change. I'm actually quite confident that my goal is to be alive to see that day, because I saw how I remember the exact day how I felt when Mao died. Okay, because that was the moment of change. I was genuinely happy. Of course, you could not reveal it. I was 19 because we went through such horrible 10 years, my teenage years, right? So we were filled with hope. And the country, then people like me, our generation, were really beneficiaries of reform and opening, and also engagement between China and the West. So I would never have received such great education and be here today without that period. So I think China still has a chance.
Jane, let's turn to our online audience for a moment.
Sure. Chinese society has undergone significant transformation since 2000 compared to the Mao and Deng eras. What are the underlying forces driving the significant transformations in Chinese society since 2000, particularly under Xi compared to the Hu-Wen period? Where do you see the primary sources of change or resistance, and how might these dynamics influence future political developments?
Yeah, I think most obviously is the sort of information sphere, because now, despite the best efforts by the Chinese government, it still cannot control all the information. It's not like the Maoist period. You had nothing. You could not gain access to information. So that is one. And the second, I would say, private wealth. And Chinese people today do have financial means to be independent, not to be part of the system. Unlike the Cultural Revolution days, you're either impoverished in the countryside or you're part of the state system. There's nothing in between. But today you actually have a lot of sort of what I call real private space, right? And so people are capable of thinking. Today, most Chinese people are pretty well educated. That is the kind of education. When I applied to college, I think only 1% of Chinese population was college educated. Today, it's at least 15 to 20%. So we're talking about a really very different, of course, different society. We don't know the political manifestation, the effects of these changes, but I can bet, once the lid opens up a little bit, you're going to see just massive change. Democracy war, if you remember the 1979, 78, 79, that kind of change is conceivable. Even Tiananmen protests. The 1980s, a lot of us were complaining about students being too materialistic. And then they showed us how wrong we were in spring 1989.
I wanted to ask you, Xi has made no secret that he wants to retake Taiwan. You mentioned that we want to avoid turning a Cold War into a hot war. That would maybe be a test of that. So I wanted to get your opinion on, will he go through with this and risk, maybe his own leadership, the party control? Because even if they win and it doesn't turn into a tit-for-tat battle with the U.S. and our allies, I'm sure China will face consequences, maybe more isolation, more deglobalization, economic impacts and things like that. And are they willing to risk even that? And the worst case outcome was, whatever, apocalypse.
I think Xi, the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government would like to take Taiwan if the price is right. Okay, so we don't know what the price is. I think if the cost is a clear military defeat, they would not do it, okay, because this is not worth it. And if the cost is just economic isolation, they would do it, because China was poor for decades. I mean, this is nothing. I think the kind of when you think about these things, never think in economic terms. Always think in security terms and in regime security, because a military defeat will be followed by big problems within the Chinese. If it's just economic hardship, they can survive. Just think about Saddam's Iraq. After the Gulf War, more than a decade, really sort of horrible sanctions and so forth. Survived. It took an invasion to get rid of Saddam. So I don't think so. Economic hardship alone. But so far, militarily they still have worries about the probability of success. So I think as long as that remains true, probably that's a safe way of, that's the sort of the effective way of maintaining peace. But at the same time, it's much more complex because we have another party in Taiwan that does its own thing, and then we have people in Washington that thinks very differently than people in China. So you have a three-party game that can cause unintended crisis. If crisis is not managed effectively, then it could really lead to serious conflict.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk today. 2 questions, please. On Venezuela, knowing that they were an important oil partner, yes. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a stronger reaction, or maybe there was something that I missed about that. Yeah. And maybe is that giving them some empowerment to take over Taiwan? You do this, I do this, that kind of quid pro quo. The second is on your wonderful presentation. There were the 4 cardinal principles. Yes. If you could please explain what that means. The second one, preserve the people's democratic dictatorship. I didn't understand that, okay. So thank you. So that's the question. Thank you.
The second one first. The Communist Party is really good at Orwellian speak, double speak. Okay, so people's democratic dictatorship. It's dictatorship, pure and simple. It's not people. It's not democratic. It's dictatorship. It's coercion. That is, we want to keep our coercive capacity, and we want to deal with anybody who challenges us very, very harshly. That's how Tiananmen happened, right? Okay. Venezuela. So 2 things, because one is how important is Venezuela. In terms of oil, it's nothing. It's like 2% of. It's important only in the financial sense, because China loaned Venezuela. I don't know how much money still, so in terms of loans, but it's a lot. So they are much more worried about getting their loan back. Ironically, what has happened has increased the probability of their getting their money back. They don't care about Maduro, right? But the current administration's policy of maintaining stability, getting the oil industry working again, I think China would love that because that will increase Venezuela's repayment capabilities. In terms of, sort of whether Venezuela would give China an excuse, I don't think they actually believe in international law that much. So it's not, I think they're not going to make the decision on the basis of the US copy. Okay, the US did this, we want to do this. They're much more pragmatic. Can we actually do this and get away with this? I think what they admire the US is the US can do a lot and get away with it. That's why they want to be another superpower, right?
You know, on the people's democratic dictatorship point, I love starting there when I talk to people in countries that are post-socialist, because it's in Article 1 of the PRC Constitution where the state self-identifies as the people's democratic dictatorship. And anyone in a post-socialist nation, say in Eastern Europe or Central Asia, who's 50 years old and older, a light bulb goes off in their head and they're like, oh, yeah, we know about those, right? And it changes the frame of reference completely. Yeah. And it's a very useful way for positioning, you know, conversations. Yeah.
I was just wondering how you feel into the current state of events. People make comparisons. And so, you know, what some of the coverage says is that in China, people looked at the way the US handled COVID and all these dead bodies and that, you know, maybe their system wasn't so bad. Or if the US loses its reserve currency status and that hurts our economy. Or just the other thing I've heard is that people in China are very concerned about anarchy. And to them, maybe a more stronger central government prevents anarchy because of history of riots or something like that. Could you address some of those? You know, we may not be the best, but we're better than the other systems.
First, really quite a lot. First, the COVID issue. I would say China handled COVID pretty well before Omicron. And then sort of it really mishandled, mostly because I would argue that Xi Jinping did not want to see a spike in COVID-related deaths before the party congress. So that's, and in fact, after COVID, after they reopened, there was this surge of deaths. In total, between, according to estimates, a lot of, I think, at least 2 million, 0.1, 1.5 to 2 million people died. You know, the stories are real. You had to bribe crematorium to get the bodies cremated. This is not sort of an example of effective government. It's mishandled. Now, I want to stay away from reserve currency. One thing about Chinese stability, I can bet stability is a universal value. But then revolutions, riots still happen. So how do you explain this sort of contradiction? Because up to a point, if the government really does not, if the government really screws things up, then you're going to have instability. You're going to have revolutions. So I would not rule out protests and other events, destabilizing events, despite the fact that most Chinese would like to have stability. In fact, I think the Chinese Communist Party is really good at maximizing, taking advantage of most Chinese people's very understandable emphasis on stability. This is a country where instability is the norm, and stability is actually the exception. When you look at if you look at Chinese history, I think once I calculated the number of years when China was actually split into different parts, roughly equal. That is the number of years when China was a unified entity and the number of years China was actually splintered. So that's why I think for people with that kind of history, it's naturally like stability.
We have a question from the online audience, Jane.
How does the friendship with Russia or friendship without limits with Russia influence the potential for change in China? Is it reinforcing or undermining this opportunity?
No, I think probably it's irrelevant, that aspect. If anything, I think it would be a net liability, because Russia would, of course, friendship with Russia carries a huge diplomatic cost for China in the context of China's relationship with Europe, right? So that is not, and in the future, when you think, what can Russia do for China? Very limited, except in a geopolitical sense, giving China a lot of diplomatic diplomatic support. So that's so I just don't see a lot of upside. But Russia is very important for China as a geopolitical partner in the context of the new Cold War.
We have room for two more. We'll end where we started with Larry, but first let me take this one.
I thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Pei. I find your argument to be quite provocative, disagreeing with the idea of authoritarian institutionalization and saying that generally the setup of post-79 was setting it up such that China was going to revert to totalitarianism eventually. I guess my question to you is, considering sort of the forewarning signs and the various weaknesses of the attempt at institutionalization, how do you rate Xi Jinping personally, his agency in that process of reversion to totalitarianism? Like, do you think a Bo Xilai could have accomplished it? Was there bound to be a Xi Jinping figure eventually? Like, is the one-man rule the equilibrium stasis for the Chinese Communist Party?
Okay. Now, we're talking about serious political science. Okay, I think agency is that if in the book I said he's an accident waiting to happen. So Xi himself, in fact, when you look at his rise to power, it was accidental. He was not destined to be the leader. He was always sort of part of this group. Okay, so but once somebody with his ambition, his political skill, his political ruthlessness, the system could not stop him. The system, and I would say the system could not have stopped Bo Xilai. He was not stopped in Chongqing. He was stopped by his police chief, whom he slapped, and who decided to go to the US consulate. That's an accident, right? So it's so I think sort of in this case, that is, we have to look at the system, the fragility, the weaknesses of the system, because if it were not Xi, somebody who came along who was ambitious and ruthless enough, who can do it, then you can actually reflect on this country. Just one man can actually do so much, where we did not know that there were so many cracks. The guardrail is really fragile, right, until now. And so I would say probably Xi himself did not anticipate this, because a lot of us we think, oh, the guy had this, but he began to push, the fence fell. Then he began to push again, the wall fell. Then nothing could stop him.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pei, knowing kind of your previous stance on Hong Kong and the development of that, what is your current impressions of Hong Kong and its future, both good and bad, on the political and social structure?
So first I want to say what has happened to Hong Kong is one of the worst mistakes. Think about it, it's so unnecessary. It's overkill. It has done so much damage for China's credibility. in the international community, and as I said, it's completely overreaction to what was happening in Hong Kong. So, and one of the worst mistakes Xi Jinping has made. When 30 years from now, historians, the party reflect on this period, I think this had to be one of those. Now, I think Hong Kong, because I was born in Shanghai, Shanghai in the 50s might be something people in Hong Kong should look at. Shanghai, when the Communist Party took over China, Shanghai was very, very dynamic. Every bit of this, like Hong Kong, probably even more so. But within 6 years, it was completely tamed, domesticated by the Chinese new system. So I'm very worried about sort of what Hong Kong would look like a decade from now. Maybe it would take longer, but once the party wants to exercise full control, it has a playbook. So you will have party organizations, you will have neighborhood committees, they have the complete system. So I hope this does not happen. It does not need to happen. I think the Chinese government has reasserted control completely. Anything addition would be just counterproductive and extremely costly. Larry.
So I want to offer an analytic hypothesis for you to react to and relate it back to what may happen to Taiwan. The hypothesis is, I don't know, but I'll pose it. It strikes me as very credible that Xi will be the paramount leader of China until he dies.
Yes.
Because he has so many enemies that he can't allow the tap on the shoulder that he visited to Hu Jintao to happen to him. And so if that's the case, you know, it's certainly plausible he's going to live at least another 10 or 15 years. And it's plausible to argue that he can't allow Taiwan to remain independent for that long, because otherwise people are going to be saying, well, okay, you know, you said the military modernization would be completed in 2027. You've built up all this military power. Objectively, the military balance across the strait is deteriorating every single year. At some point, quote, they're going to be ready.
Yeah.
So first react to the analytic hypothesis and then tell us what you think it will do to the trajectory you anticipate post-Xi if his legacy is truly the unification, as he would put it, of China, the absorption of Taiwan into China, and the really objective success in dramatically expanding China's geopolitical power.
Okay. Based on my knowledge of sort of how Chinese people, Chinese leaders rank their priorities, I would say probably Taiwan does not even rank number 5. It's not, because they worry about a lot of other things. So that is, so in other words, within the party, there's no real pressure for Xi to take back Taiwan, not within Chinese society. So in other words, this can be something Xi thinks of himself. But on the other hand, if Taiwan does something, or if they think Taiwan has done something, then it will be number 1, because Xi would feel extremely insecure if he does not react to underscore his toughness, his ability to defend China's national honor. So the political logic, the political dynamic actually is quite complex in this. So that's one. Another thing about, if Xi really wants to take back Taiwan, then he's 72, right? He better do it sooner rather than later. Because if you are late 70s, you know, you're probably not good at commanding a really serious war, right? Because it's just, you're physically unable, less fit. And so in that case, we actually need to see full-scale preparation for war. If they want to do Taiwan, I mean, they got to be prepared for war with the US. But do we actually see this? Like rhetorically, we see, I think over the long run, they've learned a lot of lessons from the Ukraine war. I wrote a piece analyzing 5-year plan. So when you examine the section on national security, actually they are preparing for full-scale war. Okay, but you don't see the immediate. That's the long plan. Okay, but you don't see a lot of immediate plans, because if you think that they want to do a war, launch a full invasion in 3 years, you know, they've got to do a lot, right? But so far we've not seen this. I think they're executing a long-term plan that will increase their options, increase their readiness, remedy a lot of vulnerabilities, but we don't see a rush to a near-term military action.
So it's always a masterclass when Professor Pei joins us, and today was no exception. Thank you very much. Please join me in
thank you.
appreciation.